Hello, everyone. This is the 53rd episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles, and I am joined by Paul from Shipley in England. We are pleased to have Mr. Davey Naylor back on our podcast. To remind everyone, Mr. Naylor is the administrator of englandstats.com. We continue our interview series with Mr. Naylor as we discuss the matches of the England national team during the 1986-87 season. Hello, Davey. Welcome back to you. Always a pleasure.
Hi, Guy. Thanks for having me back.
Last time we left off in the summer of 1986 with England ending the 1986 World Cup at the quarterfinal stage after a loss against Argentina and Diego Maradona with the famous hand of God and, of course, perhaps the best goal in World Cup history. Bobby Robson's England had performed well and ended well after a difficult start to the World Cup and now had a superstar in Gary Lineker. The team were now in a strong and confident position for the next challenge, the 1988 Euro qualifiers, in a group with Yugoslavia, Northern Ireland, and Turkey. And I also believe that following the World Cup, Bobby Robson was rewarded with a new contract until 1991. So we start off this season, 1986-87, with a friendly. On September 10th, England traveled to Sweden, to Stockholm, at Solna Stadion to take on Sweden. Now, for this match, England were missing a number of players from the World Cup. They were missing Gary Lineker, Brian Robson, Gary Michael Stevens, Peter Reid, Peter Beardsley, Mark Hateley, and Mark Wright. It was a relatively weakened England who took part in this match. So for this first match of the season, Bobby Robson selected the following squad. Peter Shilton, captaining the side from Southampton. Viv Anderson of Arsenal. Kenny Sansom of Arsenal. Alvin Martin of West Ham. Terry Butcher, who had just joined Rangers Glasgow, one of the first signings of Graham Souness as Rangers manager. You have Trevor Steven of Everton. He'd be replaced by international debutant Tony Cuddy of West Ham in the 60th minute. Then you had Ray Wilkins from AC Milan in Italy. Steve Hodge of Aston Villa. Glenn Hoddle of Tottenham. John Barnes of Watford. He'd be replaced by Chris Waddle of Tottenham in 81st minute, and Kerry Dixon of Chelsea. Just quickly going through the Sweden lineup. You have Jan Moller of Malmö, Roland Nilsson of IFK Gothenburg, future Sheffield Wednesday player, Glenn Heisen of IFK Gothenburg, future Liverpool player. He'd be replaced by Torbjörn Pettersson of Malmö in the 70th minute. Peter Larsson of IFK Gothenburg. Captaining the side, Stig Fredriksson of IFK Gothenburg. Ulf Eriksson of Hammarby. Glenn Stromberg of Atalanta in Italy. Robert Pritz of Young Boys Bern in Switzerland. Anders Palmer of Malmö. Johnny Ekstrom of IFK Gothenburg, and Björn Nilsson of Malmö, in a side managed by Ole Nordi. This match was settled by a single goal, Sweden defeating England with a Johnny Ekstrom goal in the 49th minute. A long cross from the middle was flicked on in the path of the onrushing Johnny Ekstrom, who volleyed in the winner. Now, not much can be ascertained as far as England because, like I mentioned, this was a relatively weakened side. What are your thoughts?
Agreed, yes. World Cup hangover, I think, still for this team. As you mentioned, there is quite a lot of talent missing that would have normally played. Although it's still quite a strong lineup with the likes of Ray Wilkins and Kerry Dixon, who this would be his last match, along with Alvin Martin's last match as well. They wouldn't play again. Not that they played that many times. They weren't really considered starting fodder, as it were. But it's a makeshift side really that was just fulfilling a friendly obligation, and not to belittle Sweden's win, but I think Sweden were the better team in this game, and I think Bobby Robson knew it.
We have to mention Gary Lineker had just joined Barcelona, and I'm assuming he was not released for this match.
I'm not sure about that, whether he was injured or whether it was complications due to his move to Barcelona. I don't know, to be honest.
Another point to make is this was the only time England wore the red kit during the season. For those who follow those things, yeah.
That red kit. Oh, yeah. They only won a World Cup in that kit.
Paul, what do you remember from this?
Yeah, I think as Davey said, it was a bit of a lackluster performance from England, as they often were at the start of the season. I think at that time. Also, this was a mid-league game, but there would have been league games played either side of it. There was no real international break at that point, so most of these players would have been involved in club games either side. And yeah, it's a bit of an unfamiliar-looking team, especially up front, where Beardsley and Lineker had established such a good partnership, and it's more or less Kerry Dixon on his own, I think maybe supported by John Barnes in this game, until Tony Cottee came on. Tony Cottee was unlucky really not to get more caps, I think, for England. He's a very good striker, but obviously he was an out-and-out goal scorer, and Lineker was at his peak for several years, more or less at the same time. So he never really made an international career.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's very true. He got 7 caps and never scored, never got a chance to. And most of those were, just about all of those were as substitutes, apart from one. He had 1 start in those 7 caps, which is a bit, which I think was a bit unfortunate for Cottee. He plays 2 games in 86 for England, and then the rest are in 88, 89, and his career never really takes off. Whilst he's whilst he's at West Ham, and then even at Everton. So his international career, that is. It's a shame, really, because I quite liked him as a player.
When Everton signed him in 1988, wasn't that a record at the time?
I believe so.
So we come to the following month. On October 15th, 1986, at Wembley, England started officially their Euro qualifiers by hosting Northern Ireland. For this match, we have some of the familiar names back in the side. Bobby Robson selected the following squad: Peter Shilton of Southampton in goal, Viv Anderson of Arsenal. And as far as Viv Anderson, we have to mention that Arsenal, this was their first season with George Graham as manager. And they were league leaders for a big chunk of the season. Viv Anderson owes some of his selections for Arsenal's fine form this particular season. He would supplant Gary Stevens for majority of this season. Getting back to the squad, then you have Kenny Sansom of Arsenal, Dave Watson of Everton, Terry Butcher of Rangers Glasgow, Glenn Hoddle of Tottenham, captaining the side Brian Robson of Manchester United, Steve Hodge of Aston Villa, Chris Waddle of Tottenham, Peter Beardsley of Newcastle. He replaced by Tony Cottee of West Ham in the 84th minute, and Gary Lineker of Barcelona in Spain. And going through the Northern Ireland lineup, managed by Billy Bingham, who incidentally married earlier in the day, was also simultaneously managing a club in Saudi Arabia while he was managing Northern Ireland.
I didn't know that. I didn't know he got married that day. That's great.
So going through the lineup of Northern Ireland, by now, Pat Jennings had retired after the World Cup. So in goal, you have Phil Hughes of Bury, Gary Fleming of Nottingham Forest, Mal Donachie of Luton Town, Alan McDonald of Queen's Park Rangers, John McClelland of Watford, Nigel Worthington of Sheffield Wednesday, Steve Penny of Brighton. He'd be replaced by James Quinn of Blackburn Rovers in the 74th minute. David Campbell of Nottingham Forest, Colin Clark of Southampton, Ian Stewart of Newcastle, and Norman Whiteside of Manchester United, and he'd be replaced by Sammy McIlroy of Manchester City in the 84th minute. This was strong England win. England won the match 3-0. Gary Lineker continued his goal-scoring form that he left off at the World Cup. He scored twice. He scored first in the 33rd minute. Glenn Hoddle took a corner from the right side. Dave Watson at the edge of the box headed it back into goal mouth, and Terry Butcher passed it across to Lineker, who scored from close range. England only doubled the lead late in the second half. In the 78th minute, Steve Hodge took a shot that was parried. Peter Beardsley picked up the rebound and crossed it back into the box for Chris Waddle to score. Just 2 minutes later, England scored a third goal. Glenn Hoddle won the ball in midfield and passed it to Beardsley, who slid a pass and cut the Irish defense to send Lineker through. Lineker, from a closed angle, he lobbed over Hughes for a beautiful third goal. Other things to mention, Tony Cotty, his next cap would be in April of 1988 versus Hungary. Also, Dave Watson as well. His next cap would be in February of 1988 versus Israel. What are your thoughts?
This is the second time that they've encountered Northern Ireland in qualifying. They were in the same qualifying group for the previous World Cup. It was a pretty straightforward win. Again, yes, with the main players back, Beardsley and Lineker et al. A reasonably good Northern Ireland side. Yes, you said without Pat Jennings, but there were some World Cup players in this side, and it was quite a routine win at Wembley, except, yes, as you said, it took a while to get their second goal, and then I think that the Northern Ireland legs went and they let in at the third. So it was a good night for Bobby Robson. Start of qualifying. You want to get your qualifying campaign off to a good start, and this was a very good start.
Next, we come to November 12th, 1986, again at Wembley for England's second qualifier, this time against Yugoslavia. For this match, Peter Shilton was missing, so Chris Woods of Rangers Glasgow started in goal. Again, Chris Woods was another one of Graham Souness's high-profile signings from England that season when he took over as Rangers manager. So you have Chris Woods in goal, deputizing for Shilton, Viv Anderson of Arsenal, Kenny Sansom of Arsenal, Mark Wright making his first appearance of the season from Southampton, captaining the side for the first time, Terry Butcher of Rangers Glasgow, as Robson was also missing. You have Glenn Hoddle of Tottenham, Steve Hodge of Aston Villa. He's replaced by Ray Wilkins of AC Milan in Italy in the 82nd minute, making his final appearance for England. This was his 84th and final cap. His first cap had been in 1976. I think in our last podcast, we may have mentioned that the match against Morocco was his last match, but it's actually this one. So then you have Chris Waddle of Tottenham. He'd be replaced by Trevor Steven of Everton in the 79th minute. And up front, Peter Beardsley of Newcastle and Gary Lineker of Barcelona in Spain. And I forgot to mention Gary Mabbutt of Tottenham. and he was back in the side. This is his first cap in 3 years, and he managed to score in this match. But let me quickly go through the Yugoslavia lineup as well, managed by Ivica Ozim. You have Mauro Ravnic of Rijeka, Zoran Vujovic of Bordeaux in France, Mirsad Baljic of Zaleznikar, Rafik Sabanadzovic of Zaleznikar, Marko Elsner of Red Star Belgrade, Faruk Hadzibejic of Real Betis in Spain, Haris Skoro of Zaleznikar. He'd be replaced by Semir Tus of Velez Mostar, who'd immediately be injured and replaced by Predrag Juric of Velez Mostar in the 73rd minute, just 2 minutes later. Then you have Sreko Katanec of Partizan Belgrade, Blaž Sliskovic of Olympique Marseille in France, Milan Jankovic of Red Star Belgrade, and captaining the side, Zoran's twin Zlatko Vujovic of Bordeaux in France. As we mentioned, for his return, Gary Mabbutt scored a goal for England in the 21st minute. Glenn Hoddle took a corner from the left side, and Mabbutt headed it in. England would double the lead in the second half in the 57th minute. Again, Hoddle took a corner from the left side. It was kicked out. Hoddle crossed it back to Beardsley, who passed it to Waddle on the left side, who crossed it back into the box for Viv Anderson to score from close range. England won 2-0. It was a very important win against what at this point looked like their likeliest challengers.
I remember the Gary Mabbutt goal very clearly. Two classic defenders' goals here by Viv Anderson and Gary Mabbutt. It's a solid win against a good Yugoslav side who, as you said, are the main challengers. Don't forget there are only 4 teams in this qualifying group for the Euro 88 finals. And it's important to get off to a really good start. And against the 2 better teams in the group, you've got Turkey, who at that time were you could call them whipping boys. England had already pummeled them 6 and 8-0. This is a really good score. They do play their first games at home, so obviously the bigger tests, the away tests are to come. But it's a great solid start. 2 wins from 2. And yes, just one note about Ray Wilkins. Most people remember Ray Wilkins probably in his international career about him being sent off in the 86 World Cup, but he and Brian Robson held that midfield together for the most part of the 80s. And I think he's a very underrated player, and a very underrated England player who rightly got 84 caps. I mean, Gary Lineker only gets 80, so one of England's best players. So 84 is quite good in that era. Yeah, this is a good solid win against quite a big attendance at Wembley. It wasn't quite full, but numbers had been dwindling for quite a while at Wembley. But this was, I think there were 60,000 people there, which is quite a good turnout for an England game, on a midweek England game in the middle of November.
Yes. And about Wilkins, he was quoted as saying, "My feelings upon realizing I had played my last international can be summed up in one word: choked."
I don't know whether when he said that, if that was the next day. I'm not entirely sure if he took the decision to retire or it was put upon him. But yeah.
We come to the calendar year of 1987. The year starts with another friendly. It's in Spain at Madrid at Estadio Santiago Bernabeu, with Spain hosting England. Just to provide background, Gary Lineker had joined Barcelona that season, so he was playing against their arch rival Real Madrid Stadium, Santiago Bernabeu. Just a couple of weeks before, on January 31st, Lineker had scored a hat-trick in a Barcelona's 3-2 win against Real Madrid. For this match, Bobby Robson selects the following squad: Peter Shilton of Southampton in goal. He replaced by Chris Woods of Rangers Glasgow in the 62nd minute. Viv Anderson of Arsenal. Kenny Sansom of Arsenal. Making his international debut, Tony Adams of Arsenal. I believe he would have been 20 or 21 at this point, if I'm not
20,
mistaken.
yeah.
So then you have Terry Butcher of Rangers Glasgow, Glenn Hoddle of Tottenham, Steve Hodge. In the new year, he had joined Tottenham from Aston Villa. Captaining the side, Brian Robson of Manchester United, Chris Waddle of Tottenham, and he'd be replaced by Trevor Steven of Everton in the 76th minute. And again, up front, you have Peter Beardsley of Newcastle and Gary Lineker of Barcelona. England wore an all-white kit, white shirt, white shorts, and white socks. Going into the Spain lineup, managed by Miguel Munoz. You have Andoni Zubizarreta of Barcelona in goal. Chendo of Real Madrid. He replaced by Manuel Sanchez of Real Madrid in the 62nd minute. Captaining the side, Camacho of Real Madrid. He replaced by Genar Andrinua of Athletic Bilbao in the 73rd minute. Juan Arteche of Atletico Madrid. Victor of Barcelona. Rafael Gordillo of Real Madrid. He replaced by Roberto of Barcelona in the 62nd minute. Francisco Carrasco of Barcelona. Michel of Real Madrid. He replaced by Joaquin of Sporting Gijón in the 62nd minute. Ricardo Gallego of Real Madrid. Emilio Butragueño of Real Madrid. And Ramon of Sevilla. Spain took the lead in the 14th minute. Chendo crossed from the left. Butragueño got past Viv Anderson in the box and scored from close range. However, this would be Gary Lineker's match, who would score 4 goals. His first goal was in the 23rd minute. After a scramble, Brian Robson's long-range shot hit the post and bounced back. Glenn Hoddle immediately shot, but his shot was parried by Zubizarreta. Glenn Hoddle then lobbed the cross across the goal mouth from the left side for Gary Lineker to head in from close range. 4 minutes later, in the 27th minute, Gary Lineker scored his second goal. Glenn Hoddle took a free kick from the middle of the field near the left side touchline. Viv Anderson headed it down in the path of Gary Lineker, who again scored from close range. England scored a third goal in the 46th minute, again through Lineker. Lineker stole the ball from Victor and then passed it to Beardsley on the left side. Beardsley's shot was parried by Zubizarreta, and Gary Lineker headed the rebound into an empty net. Gary Lineker would score his 4th goal in the 56th minute. A Spanish throw-in was intercepted, and Beardsley passed it across to Lineker, who took a low shot from the edge of the box past Zubizarreta, his clubmate at Barcelona. So England had a 4-1 lead early in the second half. Spain would pull a goal back in the 77th minute. A short corner was taken on the left side. Eventually, Carrasco again crossed from the left side, and Ramon headed in Spain's second goal. But it was a convincing England win away from home against a good side. Gary Lineker was being touted as the best striker in the world after his exploits in the World Cup and this 4-goal display against Spain. This was the most by an English player since Malcolm McDonald scored 5 goals against Cyprus in 1975. Just to mention that Lineker would also score 4 goals in a match against Malaysia in 1991. Apart from Tony Adams' debut, this match is always remembered as Gary Lineker's 4-goal display. this match on February 18th, 1987 against Spain.
Yes, he was in a rich vein of form. He'd already won the Golden Boot in the 86 World Cup, scoring 6 goals. He got 2 against Northern Ireland in the October 86 and came into this game and scoring 4. So he's certainly putting them away. And as you rightly said, this is the first time he scores 4 goals. He does actually do that again. It's his 3rd hat-trick, actually, for England overall. For those younger listeners, I thought that the game that England played against Spain in 2018 in Spain, it was a very similar game when they played that in Seville. England in the UEFA Nations League, I don't know if people remember that one, where during the first half England were just devastating. They were 3-0 up at half time. Wasn't quite the same scoring, but it was a very good Spanish side, and it was coincidentally the last time England had actually won in Spain. And when I saw that game in 2018, I immediately went back to that 4-2 game in 87 because it reminded me so much of that. Very, very similar things going on. And yeah, as I said, a very, very good Spanish side, and they were just seemingly blown away in the second half. 4-2. I know it's only a friendly, but to beat Spain 4-2 in Madrid is pretty special.
Plus, in those days, like this high-profile friendlies actually counted for something.
Although you wouldn't think so by the attendance. This is at the Bernabeu, and there's only 35,000 people there, which would have looked quite sparse in that stadium, I think.
There was some English interest in, I guess, the Spanish league that season because not only Lineker had joined Barcelona, but Mark Hughes had also joined Barcelona.
Yeah.
And Paul, maybe you remember this. In the early going, I think both of them were struggling, but somehow Lineker was able to find his feet, but Mark Hughes continued to struggle. And also, Terry Venables was still managing Barcelona at this time. So were Gary Lineker's matches followed in England at this point?
Yeah, definitely. With Venables being the main connection, I think there'd already been a little bit of interest in such a high-profile club, and definitely when Lineker went there was more news. You can't say there was a lot of coverage, but,
right.
but certainly it was followed more closely. And then around that time, over the next few years, there were quite a few English managers, British managers. Howard Kendall was there, and Ron Atkinson.
Oh, right.
Jock Wallace. There was a bit of a trend for British managers in Spain after that.
We first time we actually saw some Spanish football on British TV. I believe it was Channel 4 started showing on Sunday afternoons. They started showing some Spanish league games, and I think it was due to the fact that English players were there and obviously English managers were there. I can't quite remember when it first started, but I do seem to remember during the late 80s that you could watch highlights, if not live matches. I mean, there were a couple of live matches, I think. So the interest in the Spanish league was growing very much in England at that time.
Yeah, you're just starting to get a little bit more coverage, I think, of the European leagues. But this game, as Davey said, for one thing, the sparse crowd's quite notable, and also the condition of the pitch. It's very muddy. There's two things you certainly wouldn't see nowadays in international football: empty stands and muddy pitches for a game of this stature. But it was a really good result for England, and apart from bringing Tony Adams in at this point, it was quite a settled team and a very strong team, especially for a friendly. There's no real experimentation. As you say, that's probably because there's so relatively few international games that more or less the strongest team would be selected each time.
And it's more surprising in such a lean year, because I think there are only 8 England games this season. He's losing some, like Ray Wilkins, some of his more senior members, and it seems like he's quite comfortable. He brings Tony Adams in, obviously, but he seems to be have a settled squad. He's not experimenting so much, as you said, even coming up to a major tournament that you're looking like you're going to qualify for, having won the first 2 games. So it's interesting that he is not experimenting as much as you would think. But then that's Bobby Robson for you. I guess he always was very clear, although it didn't always seem so. But I think he was always very clear in his mind that the way that he wanted to go.
We come to England's next qualifier, the return fixture against Northern Ireland on April 1st at Belfast at Windsor Park, with Northern Ireland hosting England. For this match, Bobby Robson selected Peter Shilton of Southampton in goal. He'd be replaced by Chris Woods of Rangers Glasgow in the 46th minute, Viv Anderson of Arsenal, Kenny Sansom of Arsenal, Mark Wright of Southampton, Terry Butcher of Rangers Glasgow, Gary Mabbutt of Tottenham, Steve Hodge of Tottenham, captaining the side Brian Robson of Manchester United, Chris Waddle of Tottenham, and again up front, Peter Beardsley of Newcastle and Gary Lineker of Barcelona. Going through the Northern Ireland lineup managed by Billy Bingham, you have George Dunlop of Linfield, Gary Fleming of Nottingham Forest, Mal Donaghy of Luton Town, Alan MacDonald of Queen's Park Rangers, John McClelland of Watford, Paul Ramsey of Leicester, David Campbell of Nottingham Forest. He replaced by Danny Wilson of Brighton in the 59th minute, David McCreary of Newcastle, Kevin Wilson of Ipswich Town, Nigel Worthington of Sheffield Wednesday, and Norman Whiteside of Manchester United. For this match, Northern Ireland actually started better and had some chances in the early going. But England's goal in the 19th minute deflated the Northern Ireland squad, and they would go on to lose this match. So in the 19th minute, from the right side, Gary Mabbutt took a long throw in that was flicked across by Terry Butcher and headed in by Brian Robson. Just before halftime, in the 43rd minute, England doubled the lead. From the middle, Peter Beardsley sent a long pass and switched the field to the right side to Chris Waddle, who advanced and got to the edge of the box and took a beautiful curling shot past Dunlop to give England a 2-0 win. So this was a third consecutive win, no goals conceded so far, and seems set to qualify at this point, and we're in fine form.
Irish came out guns blazing in this for the first 15 minutes. The English defence were overrun, especially Mark Wright looked particularly vulnerable during this first game, but then the goal, Brian Robson's goal, just changed the complexion of the match, and it was quite easy running for England after that. So much so that they changed goalkeepers at halftime. They replaced Peter Shilton. Now, I don't think Shilton is injured at all. They just seem to be rather confident that give Chris Woods half the game. So it's a tactical substitution. So I guess you want to give Chris Woods a bit more time. I mean, Shilton is nowhere near retiring yet. He's only reached. He's got another 35 caps to go. He's sprightly at 37 and a half right now. So it's a weird thing to do, but England seem to be supremely confident, and you're absolutely right that they won 3 games, conceded no goals, and are sitting top of the Euro 88 qualifying Group 4. Yeah, this is one other thing to mention. This is Terry Butcher's 50th cap, and Kenny Sampson's 75th as well.
And as far as Northern Ireland, we have to mention that these qualifiers were beginning of the downfall of the great 80s team, because this is when their struggles really started, and I guess they had reached their peak at the 1986 World Cup, and after that they went to downward spiral and never really reached those same heights of the 80s.
They struggled to replace people like Pat Jennings. This is George Dunlop. The second England faced a different Northern Irish keeper in the home leg. So and I don't know whether you can replace somebody as great as him. So you're right. This is exactly when the decline of Northern Ireland. They were brilliant up until that 86 World Cup, and then they don't qualify for Euros, and I'm not entirely sure whether they qualify. They certainly don't qualify for the next World Cup. And
No. I think 2016 Euros is the next time
Right.
they qualify for anything. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It's a shame, really, because there's some great players in this team. Norman Whiteside, I remember watching as a Man United fan. Sorry for all those people who don't like Man United, but Norman Whiteside was like a god to me when I was growing up because he was just so young. I mean, he's still only 22 in this game, and I think he's like had numbers, quite a number of caps already at this point.
Paul, what do you remember from this match?
Yeah, I think they were always tough opponents, Northern Ireland. I think they'd probably overachieved really in reaching those World Cups. It was a great achievement for them to qualify for the 2 World Cups, but you can see maybe they've got less players from the top teams available to them at this point. Definitely, as we've said, as any team would, struggling to replace Pat Jennings. But they were difficult opponents. They obviously knew the England team inside out, and they'd met in many games during this period. So they were difficult opponents, and it was it's a good professional win, this one, I think, rather than a spectacular one. The opening goal, in fact, a bit similar to the start of the 1982 World Cup, a long throw flipped on by Butcher for Robson. It was always a ploy that Bobby Robson liked, using Terry Butcher, who he'd obviously worked with at Ipswich. But yeah, this was a good, solid win for England.
We come to the end of this month of April. On April 29th, England traveled to Izmir to face Turkey. Given England's form, this match probably looked like a formality going into it. For this match, Bobby Robson selected the following squad. Chris Woods started in goal from Rangers Glasgow. Viv Anderson of Arsenal. Kenny Sansom of Arsenal. Tony Adams of Arsenal. Gary Mabbutt of Tottenham. Glenn Hoddle of Tottenham. Steve Hodge of Tottenham. He'd replaced by John Barnes of Watford in the 75th minute. Captaining the side, Brian Robson of Manchester United. Chris Waddle of Tottenham. Gary Lineker of Barcelona. And with Peter Beardsley being absent, Clive Allen of Tottenham started. And he replaced by Mark Hateley of AC Milan in the 75th minute. This was Clive Allen and Mark Hateley's first appearances of the season. As far as Clive Allen, we have to mention that he had an excellent season that particular season. I think he scored like 49 goals in all competitions. But obviously, as far as the national team, Lineker was always going to start ahead of him. But he was just simply unstoppable that season in David Pleat's Tottenham side. He owed his selection to his fine club form. Unfortunately for England, this was a scoreless tie in a match that they were expected to win. I think Clive Allen scored a goal that was ruled offside, while for the fourth match, their defense was unbreached. They failed to score for the first time against the side that was there for the taking. I'm sure there must have been a lot of criticism for this match.
They had already beaten, again, like Northern Ireland, they were in the same group qualifying for the 86 World Cup, and they'd beaten them 5-0 and 8-0. And would, again, our next podcast, we'll talk about the home return match where England get back to form and beat Turkey 8-0 again. But this was a phenomenal performance by Turkey, who were not expected to put up much defence. England were very lacklustre. Robson had the luxury of putting his second choice keeper in Chris Woods, although he doesn't really particularly change the team too much apart from bringing Clive Allen in as well to partner Lineker instead of Beardsley. They didn't really hit it off, those two. Clive Allen only gets one more cap after this. They seem to have struggled. They have an early chance in the game and then nothing really till the last 20 minutes. I think Haitley, when he comes on, has a really good chance at the end. But to be honest, if he would have scored, it would have done Turkey a big injustice. And I remember this game. I remember the Turkish players were absolutely ecstatic at the end of the game, running around, congratulating each other. And why not? They'd done a brilliant job keeping one of the best teams in the world at bay for 90 minutes. It was a phenomenal performance on their half. Don't forget, Turkey only recently, just before, I believe, it wasn't until 2016 when they would actually score their first goal against England. They've gone, quite a number of matches without scoring against England, and it took them a long time to do it. And so the next best thing was to get a draw. It was a drab game, I guess. The Turkish didn't necessarily park the bus. They had a good few chances as well, but it was a very, very poor performance. It kind of like we're lurching from really good performances against Spain to really poor performance, which was kind of like the hallmark of this era, really. You didn't know which England was going to turn up, and this one was not the one you wanted.
So yeah, I was just going to say it's a very disappointing result for England, and yeah, a little bit like we said with Tony Cottee, Clive Allen was another one who was an out-and-out striker, whereas Beardsley complemented Lineker so well, dropped a bit deeper, and it obviously didn't really work. I mean, like you said, he had an incredible season for Tottenham in a team that was more or less built around him being the lone striker. And it just obviously didn't work in this particular game that England expected to win. And I think, did you say he got one more cap? But that was more or less it for his international career. Again, which is a shame for a striker who was always scoring goals, even till later on in his career in England, but just didn't quite work out. Again, Lineker was arguably the best striker in the world at that point, so he needed someone like Beardsley to support him, I think.
There's one other thing to mention for this game. There was apparently during the game, there was a very cold wind blowing across the ground. Whether that affected the English players, they were expecting it to be quite warm or not, I don't know. But I guess anyone that's played cold, windy football, then you'd expect the English players to put up with that. But it was a poor performance, and one that could have cost England quite a lot. Don't forget, only one team qualified from this group, and at that time they still had to go to Yugoslavia. And dropping points to Turkey could have been disastrous. It doesn't work out like that. But I think Bobby Robson would have been slightly uneasy after such a good start, 3 wins from 3, to not beat the easiest team in the group. He would have been slightly worried, and I certainly think that the British press would have been very critical of him at the time.
This was the last qualifier of the season, the fourth and the last qualifier of the season, and they had 2 more matches as far as the qualifiers. The return fixture at Wembley against Turkey and an away trip to Yugoslavia, but that's for next season. We come to the end of the season. In our 2 previous podcasts, we mentioned the Rouse Cup, where it was the continuation of the England-Scotland annual match after the dissolution of the British Home Championship. Now, this was the first year, 1987, where the organizers decided to add another guest to this tournament, the Rouse Cup. And it would turn out that for this final 3 years of this competition, the guest would always be a South American nation. For this first triangular Rouse Cup, the guest was Brazil. But this would not be the vintage Brazil side that many would expect to participate. This was a rebuilding Brazil side with many young players who were to form the backbone of the future Brazil. The Zicos, Falcaos, Socrates, those players had retired. The side was now managed by Carlos Alberto Silva, who was rebuilding a side to participate for the Olympic Games in 1988 Seoul, South Korea. Before this trip, he was unable to get the release of many players, as Brazilian clubs were reluctant to release their players, as some of them were participating either in the championship or in Copa Libertadores. Players from Flamengo, such as Zé Carlos, Jorginho, and Bebeto, who would win the 1994 World Cup, were not released initially by Flamengo. From Guarani, Ricardo Rocha and João Paulo were not released. From Sao Paulo, Careca, Luis Müller, Silas, and Nelsinho were all held back by their clubs. Of course, Careca was about to join Napoli to partner with Diego Maradona. The reason for his absence was fatigue. After some negotiations, the Brazil management were able to obtain the release of the Guarani and Sao Paulo players, except Careca, but Flamengo held firm, so the likes of Jorginho and Bebeto did not participate. For this match against England on May 19th at Wembley, Brazil would have 7 international debutants. Let's first go through the England lineup. You have Peter Shilton of Southampton in goal, Gary Michael Stevens of Everton, making his first appearance of the season. Up till now, Viv Anderson had been occupying the right back slot throughout the season. Making his international debut at left back, you have Stuart Pearce of Nottingham Forest, who would become the mainstay of the squad into the next decade. Then you have Tony Adams of Arsenal, Terry Butcher of Rangers Glasgow, Peter Reid of Everton also earned his first appearance of the season. I guess he had last played during the World Cup. And we should mention that Everton won the league title of that season. So then you have John Barnes of Watford, captaining the side, Brian Robson of Manchester United, Chris Waddle of Tottenham, and up front you have Peter Beardsley of Newcastle and Gary Lineker of Barcelona, and he'd be replaced by Mark Hateley of AC Milan in the 76th minute. Going through the Brazil lineup, you have Carlos in goal from Corinthians, Josimar of Botafogo. Of course, Josimar famous for his long-range goal against Northern Ireland during the 1986 World Cup. So you have Geraldão of Cruzeiro, Ricardo Rocha of Guarani, Nelsinho of Sao Paulo, Douglas of Cruzeiro, Silas of Sao Paulo. He replaced by Dunga of Vasco da Gama in the 82nd minute. Of course, Carlos Dunga, captain of Brazil during the 1994 World Cup and twice national team manager of Brazil. Edu Marangon of Portuguesa. He replaced by Rai of Botafogo of Ribeirão Preto. Of course, Rai is the younger brother of Socrates. You have Müller of Sao Paulo, who played in the 1986 and 1994 World Cups. So 3 World Cups. And also newly joined Everton in 1994. And you have Mirandinha of Palmeiras. More about him later. And Valdo of Grêmio. And the captain of the side was Geraldão. So, as I mentioned, for Brazil, there were 7 debutants: Geraldão, Ricardo Rocha, Nelsinho, Douglas, Edu Marangon, Mirandinha, and Valdo. And also 2 future Brazil captains, Dunga and Rai, would also make their debuts for Brazil. For this match, England were good in the early going with Peter Beardsley and Peter Reid in midfield in very good form. England took the lead in the 35th minute. Brian Robson released Peter Beardsley on the left side, and his cross was met by Gary Lineker, who scored with a diving header into the empty net. But just a minute later, Brazil tied the match. A long cross from the middle reached Muller on the right side. When he crossed, Peter Shilton was stretched beyond. He could not reach it, and he could only touch the ball, but Mirandina just tapped it in from close range. In the second half, Brazil grew in confidence and played better, but in the end, both sides were satisfied with a 1-1 tie. Most observers credited the young Brazilians for their more enterprising play in the second half. Just to mention one thing, that afterwards it would be discovered that Josimar had broken curfew and gone out at night in London the day prior to the match, and he would eventually be reprimanded, but that's another story. And also Mirandina, Brazil's goal scorer, would join Newcastle for the following season.
Yeah, England start this game really well. This is just to recap the Rouse Cup. So after the British Home Championship had ended a couple of years before, the only real profitable game that kept going was England versus Scotland, and they did that for a couple of seasons. And then they realised that they could make this into something better, so they started inviting every year a South American country. It didn't last. This was the first of a kind of like triangular, the first match of the new format of the Rouse Cup. And as you say, a very inexperienced Brazilian team that came over, but with some stars of the future in there. England start off more brightly, and then Brazil finished the game more brightly. But as you say, I think both teams were quite happy with a draw and an almost sell-out Wembley, which in the 80s was quite a rarity. But everybody obviously wanted to come and see Brazil play. It wasn't quite the team of old, but still, who doesn't want to watch Brazil?
Romario was also on that Brazilian side. He made his debut, I think, a couple of days later, I think against Ireland. Like you said, some future stars on display for Brazil. A few days later, on May 23rd, you have the annual match against Scotland, this time at Glasgow at Hampden Park. For this match, Bobby Robson will make some changes. You have players such as Shilton, Adams, Reid, Barnes, and Lineker were rested. And in their place, Bobby Robson selected the following squad. You have Chris Woods of Rangers Glasgow starting in goal, Gary Stevens of Everton, Stuart Pearce of Nottingham Forest, Mark Wright of Southampton, Terry Butcher of Rangers, captaining side Brian Robson of Manchester United, Steve Hodge of Tottenham, Glenn Hoddle of Tottenham, Chris Waddle of Tottenham, Peter Beardsley, and Mark Hateley of AC Milan in Italy. Surprisingly, Bobby Robson made no substitutions during this match. Let me also go through the Scotland lineup managed by Andrew Roxburgh. So you have Jim Leighton of Aberdeen in goal, Richard Gough of Tottenham, Murdo MacLeod, Celtic Glasgow, Alex McLeish of Aberdeen, Willie Miller of Aberdeen, Paul McStay of Celtic Glasgow, capping the side Roy Aitken of Celtic Glasgow, Neil Simpson of Aberdeen, making his international debut Ian Wilson of Leicester, Ollie McCoist of Rangers Glasgow, and Brian McClare of Celtic Glasgow, and he replaced by Charlie Nicholas of Arsenal in the 58th minute. And we have to mention that Dundee United were involved in the UEFA Cup final just days earlier against Sweden's IFK Gothenburg, so their players did not participate in this match. In any case, this was a match of such poor quality that the crowd booed the players at halftime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's strange to think of an England-Scotland game and not think of the passion, especially at Hampden, which is a paltry 64,000 people turned up to watch this match, which for an England-Scotland match is pretty poor. But yes, it was devoid of any kind of enthusiasm. Maybe it was because it was a long season, maybe because it was a competition that they didn't really want to play. But even still, England versus Scotland, it always should be very passionate affair. This was not that. The first half was littered with many, many errors by both teams, and the second half was marginally better. But it was a very poor game, really, to end the season, I'm afraid.
Yeah, Charlie Nicholas came closest, but his shot struck the bar, I guess, late in the game. And this match ended as a scoreless tie. And this was only the third time in history after the 1872 first match and another match in 1970. So,
105 times England and Scotland have played together and only produced 3 0-0s, which I think is quite a good record at this point. Incidentally, Brazil beat Scotland in the other game in the Rouse Cup to go on and win it, which was a lot better game. But we're not going to talk about that.
The season ended on kind of a low note, but the priority were the qualifiers, and England was near faultless in those matches. The objectives of the season, you could say, were met.
Yeah, it's a weird season, actually, because there isn't that many games. There's no tournament at the end of it. Bobby Robson doesn't seem to be doing too much rebuilding. He's capped Tony Adams, he's capped Stuart Pearce. We've said goodbye to Ray Wilkins.
Tony Cuddy, who just barely made any more appearances. Yeah. Very few.
It's nothing much. Players. It's a very of all. I was when we started these podcasts. I thought, well, 86, 87 season is going to be boring, so this podcast is going to be really short. But we have to do it. So yeah, this nothing much happens. England are steadfast that they get their. They're doing well in the qualifying. They're top of the group. Everything seems to be going swimmingly. There's a great win in Spain, but then there's some other drab games in there. It's out of 10. It's probably about 5. I would give England on this season. It's the middle of a road. Everything's okay. Nothing really disastrous. It's not a very interesting season in England's in all the seasons that they've done. Next season gets a little bit more interesting, but not necessarily for the right reasons.
Do you know why Gary Stevens and Peter Reid were left out of the squad for such a long chunk of the season?
I believe Peter Reid was. I know that Peter Reid was. I believe. I can't remember now. I seem to remember he was injured. And I know that Peter Beardsley was injured as well for a lot of this season. And that's why he doesn't appear so much. But not Gary Stevens, no. I can only assume that he's trying. They were either out of form or they had some sort of injury. Or he was just experimenting with some other players, I guess. But he doesn't tinker too much, and he certainly doesn't make with all the substitutes that he could make. In some games he doesn't make any substitutes, which I find is quite astonishing, really. When you're trying to, maybe he thinks he's got a good team. Maybe he thinks that the team that he's got right now, who did, I think they did a reasonable effort in the work. It took them a while to get going, but once they were flowing, they were doing well, and it took a majestic Maradona to a majestic and a cheating Maradona to thwart them in that World Cup. So the only thing I can think, he's got things in his mind that he thinks, well, I've got a settled team. I don't really need to experiment with any other players. Maybe there aren't any players coming through that he likes. So he keeps very small core of players going. It's the only thing I can think.
Yeah, I think they both missed a chunk of the season for Everton, first part of the season, and then they came back, obviously, as Everton won the league. But
yeah, because they could have been out of form because Everton won the league that season, so they must have been in great form. So it's weird that they don't play for England that much. Maybe because they are playing. I don't know. It makes no sense to me, to be honest.
Also, Glenn Hoddle also played a lot of matches, and we always mention how we're surprised that he didn't get too many opportunities. But like the previous season and this season, it looks like he was selected for most of the matches. It looks like
he had a great season this season. In that Tottenham team we mentioned with Clive Allen earlier, I think that was his last season in England actually, before he went to France. Yeah, him and Waddle particularly, and Steve Hodge, who joined during that season. Very good team that lost to Coventry in the FA Cup final. But yeah, he was having a really good season, Hoddle. And Robson was available for a lot of this season as well. It was a pretty strong, settled team, I'd say, throughout the season. As Davey says, maybe not the most exciting season, but the win in Spain really showed their status at that time. And after the Sweden game, they were very hard to beat. And I think that there was maybe a little bit more optimism going into that game in Yugoslavia that was going to be the crucial qualifier that obviously we'll talk about next time, and then what happens in the Euro 88 as well when we get there. But I think this was a sort of consolidation for England. They'd done reasonably well in that World Cup, and this was a continuation of that. And Lineker obviously really proving himself to be one of the best strikers around.
There is, just to highlight this, it sounds like I'm a bit down on this season. Well, it's not one of the most exciting England seasons, but England are still quite well. There obviously was no world rankings at the time. That doesn't happen until the early 90s. But there is a thing called the Elo Rank Ratings, which they have been retrospectively added to matches all the way back to the very first international in 1872. And at this point, England they start the year fifth in fifth ranked team in the world, and they go up to second, and they end the year as the third ranked team in the world. So with Brazil, I think are also up in the mix there in the one or two first or second places as well. So there are highly thought of team that are winning matches that they need to win, not necessarily in spectacular fashion, apart from the Spain game, which was the highlight of the season. But this is a season where they're scoring goals. Lineker especially, who I believe has put away, 5 or 6 goals this season. He scored the majority of them for England in only an 8-match season for England, which is one of the fewest that you have for a number of years. So yeah, they're a well thought of team, winning the games that they need to win, and with no particular, not in any spectacular way, but consistently, I'd say.
For the likes of Mark Hateley, you can see that his stock is kind of dropping, and this will be his last season at AC Milan as well, before he would join Arsene Wenger at Monaco, along with Hoddle, actually. But internationally, you can see that it's going to be Beardsley and Lineker up front as first choices. Steve Hodge also played a lot of matches for this season, and he's hardly regarded as like a first choice type of player, but he played a lot of matches this season.
The one thing about Steve Hodge, I always remember, he's the man who was in possession of Maradona's number 10 shirt from that game in the 86 World Cup. He swapped shirts with him at the end of that game, and he carries it around in a suitcase chained to his... Probably doesn't at all. But I like to think he carries it around in a suitcase with a handcuff to his wrist. Because I bet that shirt is worth a lot of money. So I don't feel sorry for Steve Hodge at all.
He had a few good years left as well. I think he went back to Forest and then was part of the Leeds team that won the league. But you're right, I think internationally he never really was a major part of the team after that. And I think to keep up with the kits, which you've been doing, Sean, I think was the new kit brought in was that worn for the Rouse Cup? Was that the first time that new kit was worn?
Maybe you're
Pretty
right.
sure it was introduced during the season. It was definitely
with the
more
new colors. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's different colors, right?
Yeah, we like to keep up with the kits where we can.
Of course.
I should do some kit research for the next episode. I'm behind on my kits, I'm afraid. Are they still wearing? Are they still being made by
Umbro,
is it Admiral?
yes. Umbro,
At this point, I've got the
Umbro.
82 Umbro. Sorry.
Yeah.
My favourite is the 82 kit, a World Cup kit. That's my favourite one, I think.
Oh yeah, one of the favorite Admirals kits. Yeah.
Yeah, I wear that one every time. I wore it all during the summer during the European. It did seem to bring luck.
Yeah, well, that's another podcast. Yeah.
Well, we'll talk about that in due course, I guess, if we get that far. But yes.
What do you think, Paul, generally about the season?
Yeah, I think it's a solid season, as I mentioned, and Bobby Robson's probably in one of the most stable periods of his reign. I don't think there was too much criticism apart from the disappointment of the dropping the point in Turkey. But other than that, as we've said, there's a settled squad, very strong squad with a world-class striker. Pearce and Adams, who come in, are obviously going to be big players for years to come. And I think there was maybe a bit more optimism than previously heading towards that Euro 88.
Yeah, I think Robson and the England team get a bit of a free pass from the press after the 86 World Cup because especially some of the red tops think that they were hard done by during that World Cup. So I think Robson's getting a bit of an easy ride at the moment. It soon changes, sadly. But we'll talk about that next time.
Yeah. With that, once again, we would like to thank Mr. Davey Naylor for his participation in this series. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. For any questions and comments, you may contact me on my blog and on Facebook under Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on his blog, The 1888 Letter, and on Twitter at 1888 Letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Mr. Naylor can be contacted on his website, englandstats.com, or you can contact him at support@englandstats.com and at englandstats on Twitter. Again, all this information is on the blog and Spotify posting. So, Davey, thank you once again. And
thanks, guys. Thanks for having me again. Always a pleasure.
Next time.
Talk about England football.
Yep. Thanks, Davey. Look forward to continuing next time.
Thank you.